up
This
to date and done
conference
all
will
your...
now be recorded.
Okay, it's definitely recording. She just told me. So, be interested to hear. I haven't got a poll set up on here, I'm afraid, but I'd just be interested to hear if anyone's actually done all of their EICRs. I think one person emailed me last week and said, Darryl, I don't need to come to your course because I've done them all. I thought, fantastic. That's not a problem. They've been doing it for quite a long period of time. Susan, yeah, no surprise there, Susan. That's a joke, obviously, no surprise there. But there's going to be lots of you that wouldn't have done it for lots of reasons. COVID is definitely going to be one. Landlords being awkward is definitely going to be another. Tenants being awkward is going to be another one, and probably contractors being awkward is going to, or trying to find contractors is probably a fairer way of saying it. So there's going to be lots of differing reasons as to why you may have not undertaken an EICR as of today, which is what is it today, the 22nd of Feb. So I've got about 5 weeks to sort that out before we hit the 1st of April, obviously. So yeah, I've just seen a couple of comments in there. So a lot of you are still in the process of doing them. I fully accept that. There's always going to be that issue with lastminute.com people. I fully accept there's going to be landlords who have left it till last minute, whatever it's going to be. So there's going to be a number of differing reasons as to why you would not have been able to conduct an EICR as of yet. So today I'm just going to go through it reasonably quickly. So next 20 minutes or so, I'm just going to run through the most important points in relation to you undertaking an EICR, and then at the end of it we can have an question and answer session in relation to any outstanding points that you may have. There's always going to be these ambiguities. When they write legislation, as I always say in the courses, they write it in such a way that we spend the next 5 to 6 years going through court cases to decide what they've meant. So when we talk about the 18th edition and the 17th edition, if you speak to electricians, they will come out with lots of different interpretations about what that means. So until we get a court decision, we're not going to really 100% know. So from my perspective, it's always best to take a belt and braces position to protect yourself and your client landlord. So the legislation we're talking about, my interpretation, because my interpretation may be slightly different to someone else's. I fully accept someone on this course today might disagree with me, which does happen from time to time. I'm sure you'll be glad to hear of that. And then the reality, what do I think in reality will happen? Because as I said, the difference between what the law requires and what happens in reality is somewhat different. And then we go through the questions and answers. So I'm hoping a lot of you will be already aware of a lot of the stuff that we're talking about today, but you just wanted it to be refreshed. And again, have a conversation with the other 30 odd people on this particular course in relation to what they potentially are doing. Tari, do you have over 2,000 to do, or have you done, is that your portfolio? So I don't know how many you've got left at SPK, but yeah, I'm hoping you haven't got 2,000 left to do, because if you have, then yeah, you are right, that's a big job. So in terms of, again, the first thing that I'm sure you're all aware of is the start date. So I won't go on to historically what's happened, but obviously historically this started from the 1st of June last year for brand new tenancies. Renewals, or those tenancies that went to statutory periodic. So we've been going on for the best part of the last 10 to 12 months going through EICR. So obviously the deadline date is the 1st of April 2021, which isn't that far away, 5 weeks, the best part of 5 weeks away. Now the question would be, what happens on the 1st of April in relation to non-compliance? Now, having worked with lots of councils in my lifetime, and I do quite a bit of training with local councils, having spoken to them and having a very good friend who works for a local council not very far from me, his position is actually, Darryl, it's not the top of our hit list in relation to compliance or in terms of penalties. I'm not saying that your council won't be like that, but I would be very surprised if on the 1st of April they're going to be going round working out who is compliant and who is not compliant. I'm not saying that it can't happen, but I'd be very surprised if it does on the 1st of April. So there is going to be an element of what I'll call a grace period for agents and landlords to comply, so long as you've got a genuine reason as to why it couldn't have been done. And again, without replaying all the webinars that I've done since COVID started, it's all about evidence. Why couldn't I get this particular EICR done for this particular property? Here are the reasons, and I've got very clear audit trail of why I've not been able to do it, whether it's a contractor, whether it's tenants self-isolating, whether it's the landlord being difficult or whatever it's going to be from a letting agent perspective. That's just so important in relation to what you do in terms of your due diligence. So again, the 1st of April is what the legislation says in relation to when they should all have an EICR. But I fully accept there's going to be a very large percent or a very significant minority of properties that won't have an EICR on the 1st of April. So would I worry about it? No, so long as I can show that I am in a process of getting them done. Now, I fully accept that's my interpretation, and a local council officer may say slightly different, but I would be very, very, very surprised if there is any there are any penalties attached in relation to or levy to a landlord or letting to a landlord, should I say, levy to a landlord if there isn't an EICR for the 1st of April. I can't find any landlord. Now, I fully appreciate you might tell me differently. I can't find any landlord who has been fined for not having an EICR for a tenancy that started on or after the 1st of June 2020. I don't know if any of you have had a fine. I assume you haven't because no one's told me that they have. So even retrospectively, the councils have not been issuing fines left, right and centre for those landlords who haven't been providing EICRs for those tenancies that started after the 1st of April, whether that was a brand new tenancy, whether that was a tenancy that was renewed or a tenancy that went periodic. So the evidence really clearly shows that the councils aren't proactively policing this, but that doesn't obviously mean that you shouldn't be getting them done. I just believe it gives you a little bit more flexibility in getting them done, so long as you can prove why there is a delay in getting the EICRs done. And to be honest, lots of you would have been getting EICRs done for a long, historically, quite commonly. So a lot of you may only have a few that you've had to get done recently to comply with the legislation. I think the important thing to remember in relation to liability, and this is from again, the letting agents will be glad to hear this, the landlords probably won't, especially if they assume that the letting agent is liable. The legislation itself places the liability on the landlord. So the fine is applicable to the landlord, not the letting agent. So if you have a fully managed property and you don't get an EICR done and the council turn up and say, look, we're going to fine you, they won't fine the letting agent, they have to fine the landlord, which was a little bit unfair on the landlord, obviously, because he or she may have been utilising a fully managed service, but the legislation doesn't allow for the letting agent to be fined. So the liability falls upon the landlord. It's a maximum of 30,000. I fully accept that's not going to be probably anywhere near what a letting agent's going to be, a landlord's going to be fined in relation to a civil penalty. But I assume if there's a repeat offender or someone who's not taking their obligations seriously, then the fine could be up to 30,000. And don't forget, the fine isn't just for not having an EICR. A fine could apply for not complying with the obligations under the legislation in its entirety. So, for example, if you don't provide a copy of the EICR to the tenant, that could be a fine. If you don't get the remedial works done within 28 days, that could be a fine. So even though you might get an EICR, not complying with the other obligations under the electrical safety regs could impose a fine, or the councils could impose a fine upon the landlord, and it's the landlord who is always liable to the civil penalty, which is the fine. So just be wary of that from a letting agent perspective. If you're a landlord, I don't think we have many. I think the only landlord I've got on here is Roger. I'm not sure if there's any other landlords on here. The names don't, all the full names don't appear, I'm afraid. So I've just got your initials on my screen in relation to who's attending, but I think it's mostly letting agents on this particular course today. So in relation to, so just be aware that the financial penalty is a civil penalty to the landlord, not the letting agent. So if the letting agent doesn't get it done, it's the landlord who's liable. Obviously, the landlord's just going to sue the letting agent, which is going to be the default position. So a letting agent probably would have to pay anyway, just in a roundabout way. Just be aware also, so if you don't have an EICR and a tenant is seriously injured, whilst you don't have an EICR in that period, then again, you could be subject to a criminal sanction, not only as the landlord, but also the agent. So the agent liability doesn't come from the financial penalty that the landlord may receive, although I fully accept most landlords will then sue the agent. The real issue is the criminal sanction if something does happen to the tenant. So on the 2nd of April, if the tenant's electrocuted because of a poor electrical system, then irrespective of whether you've got an not respective in relation to the EICR, that if you haven't got one, then obviously from that perspective, you could be under health and safety legislation. So the agent is going to be culpable if something does happen to the tenant in relation to not having the EICR and then being injured subsequently. So that's the liability stage. But the important thing to remember there is the financial penalty is that of the landlord. Now, the other question I've got quite a lot of questions on is competency. And again, this is the hardest part to interpret because it doesn't say exactly what an electrician should be. Unlike gas, which is nice and simple, we have to use a gas safe registered engineer. There's a bit more flexibility in terms of electricals, and it's all about, are they competent to do the work that you're asking them to do? And again, how long's a piece of string in a sense in relation to what you define as competent? So from my own perspective, I've narrowed it down and I've said, actually, I'm just going to stick to the ones that have been inserted into the guidance. So most of you have probably read the government guidance. So for my own sanity and just to make sure that I'm utilising the right person, I would only use those electrical contractors who could prove membership of NAPIT, NIC, EIC, which I always pronounce wrong, or they have Trustmark. And most of the ones that will have Trustmark will be members of NAPIT or NIC, EIC. And the obligation in relation to compliance falls upon you as the letting agent or landlord. So again, I'm not going to do a whole separate course on contractors because that could be another hour or so. But as you probably are all aware from previous webinars that I've run, it's just so important that as a letting agent in particular, that you've checked the competency of your contractors, whether it's a handyman, whether it's a gas safe engineer, or in this particular instance, an electrical contractor. So have I got the evidence to prove that they are competent? Because they have a logo on their website, or they look like they're competent, then that doesn't mean they are. If something does happen to the tenant, whatever in future, that's what will come into question. What did you do as an agent or the landlord to make sure that they are competent? So in terms of the reports themselves, you'll see a picture on your screen in which I know it's not that clear, but that's what I would accept as a EICR, electrical installation condition report. So that's from NAPIT, and that's what I would say looks like a genuine EICR report, and they're the ones that I would be accepting as my competent reports. And we're going in a little bit more detail about the contractors themselves. And then the next one obviously is probably going to be the most common that you've come across, which is the NIC EIC report. Again, they're the only two that I would accept personally. I fully accept there are other shades of EICRs out there, but from my own sanity and from me dealing with it from a compliance perspective, they are the only two organisations that I would accept. Again, it'd be interesting to hear if anyone else has accepted any other electrical contractors in terms of a organisation in relation to EIC reports, but they're the two that I would stick to as a letting agent or landlord, and they're the two that I think the councils would be most familiar with, so therefore they're probably the ones that they would accept as being competent. So it's all about making yourselves or making your lives a little bit easier in relation to EICR reports. So in terms of what you'll need to do as a landlord or letting agent, and this, if I'm being honest, this applies anywhere across the board for all contractors that you utilise, the guidance and also previous court decisions all look at, okay, what did you do as a letting agent or landlord to prove due diligence? And I'd always say you want to see a copy of their qualifications. And if you go onto the NAPIT website, or if you go onto the EIC NIC EIC website, you'll find references to the contractors and their qualifications, etc. I think on NAPIT, it actually has pictures of the person that is qualified to do the work that you're asking them to do. So you can cross-check to make sure that the contractor is indeed competent. And that's the due diligence that you would need to undertake as a letting agent. So you need a copy of their qualifications on file and their insurance, the professional indemnity insurance. The guidance even goes further to say that they should sign a checklist of that, as in the contractor should sign to say that's what they've given to you as evidence of their competency and their qualifications. I'm not too sure if it needs to be signed, so long as you've got that on your file and you can prove that if anything does happen to the tenant after an EICR has been undertaken, I think that would be sufficient in relation to your due diligence evidence. Hopefully you're all okay thus far. The EICR report itself, electrical installation condition report. So we'll go on to EICs very shortly, because I think you can still accept some EICs, which are electrical installation certificates. So long as they cover the whole system, you'll be fine. So they cover, in terms of the electrician themselves, they do a percentage of the system. So they don't check the whole system, otherwise they would be there for a long time. So they check around about 25% of the electrical circuit, if that's the right way of referring to it. So sometimes you'll see on the EICR, it will say what percentage of the circuit system that they checked. And in most cases, it's somewhere between 20 to 25% that they would check. They don't check the whole system. As I said, otherwise it would be a rather lengthy report in that sense. So they check about 25%. What 25% they choose to check, I think, is down to the individual electrician. I don't know if anyone has any more experience of it than that, but that's where we are. You can accept an electrical installation certificate as a EICR so long as it covers the whole of the circuit. So a brand new build would be a very simple example. So a brand new build won't have an EICR, it would just have an EIC, an electrical installation certificate. If they've rewired the whole of the property, again, you won't need an EICR, the electrical installation certificate, so long as it says it covers the whole of the electrical system, then that would be sufficient again as a EICR for the purposes of the legislation itself. So again, you can accept, you don't have to accept an EICR, so long as you can accept an EIC, so long as it covers the whole system. Again, that's a lot of people have been sending me those EIC reports saying, Daryl, or EIC, shall I say, saying, Daryl, does that cover as an EICR? And it does, so long as it covers the whole of the system itself. Which is what the last point on this particular slide shows. In terms of remedial works, as you'll all be aware, C1s and C2s or further investigation fall under the remedial obligation. So you will have up to 28 days or shorter. So you've got to make sure that you read. You can read the report to make sure it may be a shorter period to undertake those remedies. And that's the important thing. So 28 days or shorter to undertake those remedies. And the important thing from my perspective, obviously, is to make sure that you have evidence that you have undertaken that work. You don't need another EICR report. You don't need an EIC. A simple invoice from a competent contractor, I assume probably the same person that you've utilised for the first EICR, is sufficient in relation to your evidence. Now, the legislation makes it a bit more awkward. It says when you've done that, you must provide a copy to the tenant and the council of that completion. Now, I fully accept that probably in reality is not going to happen, especially to the council, but that's what the law requires. So when you've undertaken those remedial works, you have to provide a copy to the council and the tenant in relation to those works being undertaken. And to the council, you've got to provide them with a copy of the original EICR and also confirmation of the work having been undertaken. So just be wary of that. Again, if you didn't do that and the council found out, in theory, they could fine the landlord up to £30,000. I'd be very surprised if they did, but the law allows them to do so. And so if you were a repeat offender, then the council could take that into account when issuing fines out. Again, for me, councils are very reluctant to issue fines unless they have to, because there's a lot of paperwork for them to fill out. So it's only going to be really the repeat offenders, which I believe will be the people that incur the fines. But again, as letting agents, they expect you to be professional. So unless you've got a really good reason as to why you couldn't do A, B, and C, then they might take a harsher look at you as a professional letting agent. Yeah, they can do. If they request the work to be done, Harry, yes, they can do. On the 28 days for an unsatisfactory EICR point, can the council request the works be done within 7 days. That they can. The councils can pretty much ask you to do whatever they feel is necessary. So if they say to you, you've got to do X, Y, and Z, then yes, they can absolutely expect you to be doing that. So again, if you don't comply with their requirements or their request, Harry, then you would be obligated, or you could be subject to a fine or incur a fine in relation to that, shall I say. The last point on this particular slide, and again, it's not something which I would encourage you to do, but some people say, look, Darryl, we've got an unsatisfactory report. Can we move a tenant in? And actually, the law says you can. I'm not saying I would move someone in under a C1, because that's obviously that is life-threatening, but you could move someone in under a C2 or further investigation, so long as you get the work done within the 28-day period or shorter if the report says it itself. So I'm not saying that's something I would encourage you to do, because in a sense, you should be getting these reports done at the earliest opportunity. But if you had an EICR done today and it come back unsatisfactory, it had a number of C2s, you could move a tenant in tomorrow. The law allows it. It just says that you must have a valid EICR. You do have a valid EICR. It's just unsatisfactory. It's no different actually to a gas safety. I could have a gas safety done today. That gas safety could say unsatisfactory, but I could still move a tenant in under gas safety legislation because I have a valid gas safety. It might say unsatisfactory, but from a legal perspective, it's a valid gas safety for that purpose, which I know sounds rather illogical, but that is what the law allows you to do. So you've got to take that position in relation to your risk appetite as a landlord or a letting agent. I certainly wouldn't be moving anyone in under a C1, most definitely. But in most cases, I don't think anyone's had a C1. I think the electrician would either do the work then, or they would cap it off or switch it off is probably maybe another scenario. I don't know if anyone's had any C1s and what the electrician did, but I think in a lot of cases, they would probably phone you when they were there and they would say, look, I've got a couple of C1s. Do you want me to fix them now at this
Darren,
cost? Yes.
Darren, Roger Eves.
Hi, Roger.
Hi. Yes, I had a C1, as you know. The tenant in there is actually themselves an electrical contractor. They're tampered with wiring. The EIRC was done on Friday. The electrician who's conducting the work isolated the ring main to that area, only to be told by the tenant, don't worry, as soon as you go, I'll reconnect it. I'm a confident person.
There's nothing you can do about that, Roger, sadly. As you said, the tenant's in charge now. But yeah, your electrician's done what your electrician's meant to do. They've isolated that particular system, so they follow what the law requires. But in terms of moving people in, you could still potentially move people in under C2. But yeah, sorry to hear your story, Roger, I'm afraid, in relation to that particular tenant.
No worries.
If you could just mute yourself. Yep, cheers, Roger. So yeah, C1s and C2. I don't think anyone else has any other C1s, but again, it's not something I would consider moving people in under. In terms of EICRs themselves, historically, again, you can, if you've got a current EICR, then that current EICR is still valid. So if it's got 5 years on there, that 5 years will apply. I fully accept there's this ambiguity between it being compliant with the 18th edition when it's not, it's compliant with the 17th edition. I would probably, for all current EICRs you had prior to the 1st of June last year, I would say I would probably just get a confirmation from the contractor that that EICR is still compliant in relation to today's requirements in relation to an EICR. And I would probably say in the majority of cases, if not all of them, that would be sufficient. I fully accept there's going to be lots of letting agents out there who haven't got that confirmation from the original contractor. But again, belt and braces, just go back to the person that originally did that EICR and say, can you just confirm that you believe that this system is still safe as of today, whatever it's going to be. So that's what the legislation, or that's what the guidance says. The legislation is a little bit more ambiguous. The guidance says that's what you should do. You should just touch base with the original person that conducted the EICR to make sure that they are happy that that EICR is still compliant as of today. In terms of, I said, in terms of validity, it's 5 years. It's valid for 5 years from the date. So if you've got an EICR that's valid for 10 years, you would only take it for 5 years from that date. So from the date it was conducted. So even if it says 10 years, you would shorten it, or the legislation shortens it by default to 5 years. So Again, that's something which I know lots of you are aware of, but that always does come up as a question. The other one which has popped up loads and loads of times, and again, for me, it's pretty crystal clear. I think people have asked me to dig out bits of wording from the legislation itself, so which I have, and it very clearly says that if the report states less intervals than 5 years, you have to follow whatever that report says. So whatever the electrician interprets as his or her position in relation to the frequency of your EICRs or EICs, you have to follow. So if it says it must be done every 12 months, it must be done every 12 months. If it says change of tenant, it must be done on change of tenant. And I saw one the other day which said change of tenant and change of owner. I'm not too sure why at all an EICR would say change of owner, but it did say it on the report. So I'm sure lots of you will have different stories about what your EICR says. But again, from my own position, each electrician will take a different position in terms of their interpretation. I know lots of you will be using electricians who will very clearly say, look, we're just doing it every 5 years. That's a default position. And then some of you, I'm sure, will have landlords who use electricians where it will say for a shorter period of time. And if it is for a shorter period of time, you have to comply with that shorter period of time. If it says change of tenant or change of tenancy, that means a brand new tenant occupying the property. So it doesn't mean if you renew the tenancy, you need to get another tenant, you need to get another EICR. That's not the case. But if it says change of tenant, my legal position is that means a complete change of the tenant in occupation. And then you would have to get an EICR. Why anyone would say change of owner, I do not know. But that was on a report I saw the other day. So just be wary of that. I'm not too sure if there's any other specials that anyone's seen in relation to how frequent it should be done. But personally, I'd only be using an electrician that said every 5 years. So I'm sure lots of you have found electricians out there that will just say that by default, but there will be the odd awkward electrician that will say for a shorter period of time. If they do say that, then you have a legal obligation to follow whatever they say on that particular report. In terms of provision, so again, just be aware this isn't linked to section 21 or any other compliance in relation to possession. So if you don't have an EICR, it doesn't stop you getting a section 21 or serving a section 8. So it doesn't affect possession notices, and there's no compensation claim for the tenant. So if you don't have an EICR, the tenant can't sue you, unlike deposit legislation. So the penalties are only levied by the local council. Obviously, if someone did die and then you didn't have an EICR, then you might have health and safety issues there. But in relation to penalties, there are less penalties, unlike gas safeties, etc. So, or deposit protection. So just be wary of that. So if you don't provide a copy of the EICR, even though you got one done, you could be liable to a financial penalty, but it would not stop you from getting possession of the property. So the government have been a little bit simpler, more trying to think of the word now, being less onerous upon you as letting agents in relation to serving your copies of the EICR. So you must serve it before occupation. That's what it says. So again, making sure that you provide evidence that you have served it to them before occupation. They've added another couple of awkward ones, as I said. 28 days to an existing tenant. So if you're getting an EICR done today for an existing tenant, you have 28 days to provide them a copy of that EICR. So again, evidence. What evidence do you have in relation to providing a copy to the tenant? Unlikely. 28 days to prospective tenant. I don't think that's I think I missed out the word tenant there, but a prospective tenant if they ask. So unlikely, but that's what the law requires. So that's what I'm saying. In terms of a new property, don't wait till last minute before they move in. In theory, if a prospective tenant asks for a copy of the EICR, you have a legal obligation to provide it to them within 28 days, which is highly unlikely. I don't know if anyone's been asked that, but that's what the law requires. If you do get asked as a letting agent or landlord, you have to provide it to them within 28 days. And the last one on that slide, or the second one, last point on that slide, is you must provide it to the council within 7 days if asked, which is unlikely unless obviously the council are involved with any complaints regarding the electrical system or whatever it's going to be. So that's what you're obligated to do if the council asks. And the last one it says is that you must give a copy to the next electrician. So if the EICR is up for renewal, then you must give a copy of the previous EICR to the electrician for their records. So again, they're the processes that you need to follow. I fully accept there's a difference between what the reality and what the legislation requires, but this is what the legislation requires in relation to compliance. And in theory, if you don't comply, you could be held liable to, or the landlord, shall I say, could be held liable to the financial penalty. And then you'll be glad to hear, and my sort of last slide is really about, again, the thing that will pop up over and over again is access. Access to the property. I mean, I know I'm working with a few agents at the moment where lots of people are refusing access to a property to do an EICR. So evidence trail, I've got witness statements if you need them in relation to your members of staff or the contractors filling them out. So if you want to ask me for those, I can get them sent to you. So evidence is really important. I would personally say that I would inform the local council that you're unable to undertake an EICR for this particular purpose. So again, that shows your due diligence. I don't think you can just stop checking. So even though the tenant said, I'm not letting you in because of COVID, it's probably, especially now we're coming out of lockdown, hopefully today, in the sense that the Prime Minister has an announcement today, then I would personally say that I would have a diary to recheck once a month in relation to gaining access for an EICR. And the last point is a bit of a not an argumentative point, but legally you should start seeking possession. So if they're not allowing you to go into a property to do your safety obligations as a landlord, then legally I would argue that you have to be proactive in seeking possession, which I know at the moment it's not easy, so I fully accept that. But obviously, from a legal perspective, you can't just let someone sit there without allowing you to go in to do X, Y, and Z in terms of gas safeties or EICRs or whatever else you're expected to do as a professional letting agent or landlord. So that's my last slide in terms of access, and I'm slightly over in terms of my timing, so just over half an hour or so in terms of covering the basic position in relation to EICR. So as I said, I fully accept there's always going to be a position in relation to the legislation itself and what the law requires of you and what practically you can do as a letting agent. I think the most common questions at the moment are in relation to what an EICR report looks like. And that's why I said, look, actually, I believe these are the two that I would accept as an agent. I would accept the NAPIT and the NIC EIC, because I fully accept now you're probably getting loads of landlords sending you in reports which will look like, I think someone sent me she referred to it as a Mickey Mouse report, and it did. It was like one side of A4 that looked like it had been written by a 5-year-old. So again, that would not be sufficient for the purposes of what we are doing as letting agents. So again, when you're getting those reports sent in, it's your obligation as the letting agent, I would argue, under health and safety regulations, to check that those EICR reports are suitable for what the legislation requires. And if they are not, then you should be instructing contractors to do the work on the landlord's behalf to protect the landlord. And if the landlord's not prepared to accept that, again, easy for me to say you disinstruct, because the last thing you want is something happening to the tenant. Because if you're managing a property and it doesn't have an EICR, and you were compliant in it not having an EICR, then I would argue that you are responsible also criminally under health and safety at work regulations. So that's me done in relation to the slides. I don't know if anyone has any questions from audio side, but I'm just going to run through the questions on the typed side or the written side, which you can see in your chat boxes. So Faye has just said, is it law that we must provide the tenant a copy? Is this something that we must do? I'm not too sure what you mean, what point you're referring to, Faye, but yeah, you must provide a copy before they move in. You must provide a copy within 28 days of a renewal EICR being done, or if there's a current tenant in situ, you've got to prove that you've done it within 28 days of the EICR being done, and then you must provide a copy to the tenant of any remedial work that has been undertaken. So you don't have to provide another EICR report, just an invoice or something to confirm that the work has been done. I assume they're going to know it's been done because they're living there, but from a legal perspective, you have to provide that evidence to them. in theory, if you don't do that, then you're not compliant with what the law requires. So if the tenant complains to the local council, you could, or the landlord could, shall I say, be subject to a penalty of up to £30,000. Unlikely, but it could happen. I don't know if anyone wants to stick their neck on the. Has anyone been fined yet? I'm not aware of one landlord or letting agent who's been fined for not having an EICR. And considering we're almost 10 months into having EICRs, obviously it came into force on the 1st of June 2020. So I assume no one has, because no one's told me they have, although I fully appreciate you're not going to admit to it. But I'd be interested to hear. You can do it privately if you want to email me privately or chat to me privately. You can tell me that. Susan's just asked the question. We have an EICR on one of our properties conducted last year, but since COVID, we have been able to get in as the tenant is shielding as ill. We have done witness statements for this and keep asking, but still no joy. Yeah, that's going to happen a lot, Susan. So you've done the EICR, but you've been unable to do the remedial work. Yes, you're in breach of the legislation, but I would argue you've got a very, very clear evidence trail of not being able to do it for a genuine reason. So unless the council take a huge dislike to you and Richard, I see no reason as to why they would fine you. To be honest, I don't think they'd be interested. But again, from my perspective, you said you informed the council. I would inform the council, Susan. Is it Froome? I can never get the council. Is it North Somerset? I can't remember the district we're in now, but that's what I would be doing. Dawn's just said about an EIC, so an electrical installation certificate for a full rewire. Ooh. You've got an EIC, but the address doesn't match. Yeah, I would probably go back to the original electrician, Dawn, and ask them to just redo it with the new address on. I fully accept they may have to ask you some questions, but I assume the property hasn't changed whatsoever. So you can just explain to them the reason as to why you need a new EICR or EIC, shall I say, for that particular. I'm sure there wouldn't be any real issues with them not backdating it, but reissuing you one with the new address on. So that's what I would do. I'm not too sure if it's got if it's got a different address to the address that you're renting out, then obviously there's going to be that ambiguity, which I can't say what will happen. There's a very plausible reason as to why it happened, so the councils may accept that. But from my own perspective, I would probably just get them to send you a new EIC with the new address on. That would be my advice. Gaynor's just said our previous electrician gave up self-employment and went into employment December 2019. How can I show all EICR are correct? They were all done under the 17th or 18th edition. We have an EICR for every property. Yeah, I know you do a lot of HMOs, Gaynor. So yeah, it's a difficult one. That's what the legislation, that's what the guidance says. The legislation doesn't say that. So that's an important point just to flag up. So the legislation doesn't say anything about going back and checking to say that the original EICR is compliant or safe, should I say. So at the moment, if your previous electrician is no longer an electrician, there's not a great deal you can do. But I fully accept that particular point in the guidance. I'll be very surprised if many letting agents went back to the original electrician to say, is it safe? I don't know if anyone has done that, have they? Has anyone gone back to previous electricians and said, can you just confirm that this system is safe? I would probably say it's going to be very, very low percentages. But that's what the guidance says, which is different to what the legislation requires, just to make you aware of that. So if that's your case, Gaynor, I probably won't go back. I probably wouldn't do anything. So long as you're happy that the electrician was competent in the first place, that would probably be my position. Yeah, Dawn, sorry, if he wants to charge, then sadly you're going to have to bite the bullet, would be my answer to that one. Obviously it's your landlord, not you, but yeah, that's what I would say in relation to that particular position in terms of him reissuing a new EICR with the correct address. I assume it's going to cost him to do the work, so with the greatest respect, I think you're going to have to pay him, would be my position. Tony's just said we have some reports which are called domestic visual condition reports with a date next due to be checked. Does it have to be titled EICR or EIC? It doesn't, but it needs to be a report which covers the whole of the system. And domestic visual condition reports, I don't think fall under that. I assume the word visual means that they've just looked at it rather than actually done any testing, which is what they do under EICRs. EICs, they're actually doing the work when they're there, so they're testing it by default. EICRs are just testing a percentage of the system. I assume domestic visual condition reports aren't sufficient because they are not testing the system. I've not seen one before myself. I'm sure. I don't know if you've sent me one, Tony. I know you've sent me. I know you have sent me previous EICR, so I don't know if you sent me a domestic visual condition report. But I would argue that is not compliant with what the legislation requires because it's not testing the system. Okay, we used to have these alongside. Yeah, pre-tenancy checks fine. I've got no problem with that. Under your fitness for human habitation, under HHSRS, visual checks between tenancies is what you want to be doing. And I think in most cases that can be undertaken by a member of staff or a check-in member of staff. So whether there's a change of tenant, I would argue, unless the EICR report says it, you do not have to get a new EICR. What you need to do as a competent and professional agent is to make sure that you have visually checked it. Now, that can be a member of staff or that could be the check-in clerk. So long as you have written evidence of that being done, that from your health and safety perspective is covering your own back. As I said, fitness for human habitation and HHSRS, Housing Health and Safety Rating System. And Joanne said, if we have a HMO, is it the whole building that needs a report and the bed sits or just the bed sits? In a sense, Joanne, you need a report for the whole of the building, which would include the individual bed sits themselves. So a report for the whole building would be legally required anyway for a HMO. So that's what you would be giving to the tenant, a copy of the whole EICR report for the whole of the HMO. Because don't forget, they would be utilising the bed sits and the common areas. So they would need a report for the whole of the building, if that helps. But that, if I'm being honest, hasn't changed since that's been in force since 2006 when the HMO regulations came into force. The HMO management regs 2006. I don't know if there's any other questions either by the chat box, which you can all see, or by audio. But I'm hoping to an extent that's been helpful just to refresh people's memories in relation to the legislation itself. If you've got any other questions, as always, as part of being my client base, you're more than welcome to email me if necessary. I fully appreciate it's going to be a busy 5 or 6 weeks for some of you, especially you at SPK if you've got 2,000 to do. But yeah, if there's any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. That's what I'm here for. But as I said, I think there's going to be a difference between what the law requires and what is going to happen in reality. If you can't get them all done by the 1st of April, so long as you've got an audit trail as to why they've not been done or why you couldn't get them done, then please have that audit trail. That's really, really important. And the other thing I think will happen over the next couple of weeks is lots of landlords sending you in their EICRs, which again, you'll need to double check to make sure that they are compliant themselves. And I personally would only use NAPIT and NIC EIC. And if you get any other reports, then you may need to dig in a bit more to make sure that they are competent for what they're being asked to do. Otherwise, it's what time is it now? It's 1:45. I don't know what time Boris is on, but I'm going to go and listen to Boris now. I think talk about the lockdown restrictions, etc. So I'll put the recording on my YouTube channel for any of those that need to re-watch it again. Otherwise, have a great day, and I will speak to you all soon, hopefully. Thank you.